morning, everyone. Today, we're looking at governance areas to focus on in 2021. It is a panel discussion this morning, so you would have seen it is a much longer session than our usual Wednesday morning webinars. For this morning, we've got our facilitator, which is Juanita Vorster. She will be facilitating the discussions and will field your questions when we get to the end as well. And our panelists are Advocate Faye Mukaddam, Ansie, Ramalho, and Ralph Patmore. All three are long-standing IoDSA faculty members. They all are non-executive directors, so they've got practical exposure and experience, well-versed in corporate governance, and are definitely going to share with you some of their thought-provoking views this morning in terms of some lessons learned, as well as what to look forward to and what we should be focusing on, not just this year, but beyond as well. Just a quick overview on what the agenda is going to be like. We'll have a panel discussion until around 10:30, and then we'll move into a Q&A session and allow our members to get more involved and ask their questions. So, Juanita, I'm going to hand over to you, and I will see you all a bit later on.
Thanks, Vicky. Good morning, everybody. So I was going through, I had a bit of nostalgia last night, and I was going through the photos on my phone, looking at everything we as a family did when we were forced to not move anywhere but our private homes. And I found really interesting the things that we did then to pivot and to make it nice for the kids and to make it nice for ourselves and to figure out a way to live in this new normal. And a year on from now, none of that is strange. None of that is new. Everything is absolutely just kind of as if we've always done things this way. And it's a good time now when we're in this mindset of it's not strange anymore. It's not weird anymore. It doesn't frighten us anymore as much, to then say, well, let's get our feet back under us. The COVID-19 pandemic came and wiped everything off the table and everybody had to scramble. A year later, it's a good space to say, let's breathe, get our feet under us and focus again and get away a little bit from the reactive mode we've been pushed in and start becoming more proactive again. That being said, during that time of massive upheaval, I'm sure that many of you, maybe had a board agenda and you had a board meeting and you had a strategy and you had a plan, and then suddenly you had to start over again. And I'm thinking for a lot of you, like for me, those pre-pandemic plans, those pre-pandemic thoughts and strategies and focus areas never quite received the attention they should have. So today, the structure I'm going to follow during this panel discussion is a little bit catch up. Let's catch up again with the pre-pandemic issues. And I'm going to ask the panelists for their opinions on what remains governance issues, even pre-pandemic, and what should we be catching up on. And then we'll have a look at keeping up with the lessons we've learned during this pandemic, because it's easy to learn lessons. It's harder to remember them and to implement the lessons learned. And then we're going to have a look ahead at what we should prepare for, as Faye put it yesterday during our preparation, for a potential flock of black swans that might be coming our way. Right, so catching up, starting with Ansie. Ansie and then Ralph and then Faye, please. In terms of catching up, the pre-90 or pre-pandemic issues, what are key issues that you see that remain or that should remain on top of board agendas that shouldn't just be wiped off because we've had a pandemic?
Thank you, Juanita, and good morning to you all. Juanita, I think it's very important that as boards, we don't get distracted from the fundamental issues by the COVID pandemic. Yes, of course, it was a life changer globally for all of us, our personal lives, our business lives, but we must not lose sight of the bigger picture. And what was there before the COVID pandemic is still there. It is just that I think the COVID pandemic showed up the fault lines in our earlier thinking and showed up some of our vulnerabilities. But the issues that were front of mind before COVID are still there. And here I can just mention a couple, and here I always like to refer to the World Economic Forum and the way that they depict, this year that they departed from their normal depiction of the key risks. But if those of you are familiar with how the World Economic Forum shows its risks as a result of its own research, the global risk, you will know that they use certain colors to show those risks. And the green risks, the environmental risks are green. The technology risks are yes, they purple, and then the geopolitical risks, for example, are orange, and the economic risks blue. And if you look at how they compare the risks for the past 10 years, you will see that 10 years ago, we started off with a huge number of economic risks, of blue risks. And then gradually over the last 10 years, those risks became more environmental. It's just green all over the place for the last couple of years, political, technological, and societal. So all of those risks are still there. And if the pandemic has done anything, it is highlighted, as I said, our vulnerabilities, but that doesn't change the underlying areas where these risks still are. So I'm just going to mention one example to just illustrate the effect of the pandemic on a risk that's been well known for a while. So cybersecurity, for example. That was a very pertinent and still is a very pertinent issue for our boards and should still be on our agenda. But it has now shifted slightly or attained a bit of a different nuance in that on top of that risk that we need to come to terms with, we also need to work with the complexity of that we deal with our customers on a remote basis, and that our workforce work remotely for the most part. And so that is added to the complexity already. And then, as we know, it's not only a related aspect to data security is data privacy. It's only when we are adhering to the data privacy concerns that we can actually achieve data security. There's legislation that's been introduced internationally in Europe, far-reaching legislation. So if you're a South African company dealing with European clients or dealing with other European companies, very strict legislation in place that you can fall foul of. In South Africa, the POPI Act is coming in operation the 1st of July. So it's much of the same, to conclude just on my little bit, but with different nuances and focus points, I would say. Thanks, Juanita.
That makes sense. Thanks, Ansie. Faye, your opinion on the things pre-pandemic that still deserve attention now and that board should catch up on?
Sorry, I thought Ralph was going to be next. So
did I forget my own order?
It's fine. I'm used to being sidelined. So
I am so sorry, Ralph. I am so sorry. I should make better notes for myself. So then, since I put my foot in it, Faye, you first, and then Ralph and I will make up afterwards.
He's going to hold it against me, Juanita. You know that.
Oh, he should hold it against me first.
Perfect. I think that Ansie's raised several critical elements, and the key issue is that what went before is still relevant today and probably will be relevant going forward. The items that we had considered prior to the pandemic as directors and as boards in terms of our internal focus and looking at what our governance framework was, whether it was fit for purpose, whether it was whether there was commonality in terms of the board members pulling in the same direction, etc., and looking at the cycles of our strategic planning and where we were heading. None of that falls away or should fall away. But of course, because you've got this flock of black swans that have appeared on the horizon, and the jury's still out as to whether we could have foreseen and should have been better prepared or not. But now that we have that, we've been given an opportunity, as you know, disastrous and really tragic some of the consequences have been. We've been given an opportunity, I think, to take professional pause. And especially, Ansie talked about the fault lines, especially those boards and those entities that maybe, weren't operating optimally, where the robustness and the resilience and the agility was lacking. That's where you take professional pause and you leverage this opportunity to reset, recalibrate, and reconsider your approach from a board perspective in terms of that strategic planning process. But at the end of the day, what you need to remember is whether you look at the different risks that are being thrown up, and we look at globally and then continentally, nationally, etc., and then from an industry sector specific that impacts the business itself, is that your strategy, your risk, your sustainability, your performance, underpinned by the culture, all still stands together. And that's governance 101, and that's never going to change. But I do think that we have seen very critically, you use the word pivot, which has become the COVID word, at the moment, how many companies were unable to pivot. And we have for a very long time said to boards and to directors, ask of your organizations, what business are you actually in? And if I can just use an example there, these young men had established a company a few years ago selling board shorts. I think it's called Grenadilla. I've given this example many times before. And obviously with the lockdown being introduced, board shorts and the ban on access to beaches might have been a problem in terms of selling product. And so what you have to do, and I believe that they did it quite well, is ask, well, what business am I in? So I'm not in the business of selling board shorts, but rather I'm in the business of e-commerce and I have a technology platform. So their pivot quite quickly was to look at what could they sell. And they moved to consumables, etc. But what can I sell using my available platform? Now, if you look at that, the old, in terms of sustainability linked to strategy and risk, if the old issues around sustainability, liquidity, and managing your balance sheet in a way that you are able to ride out the storms and take advantage of the opportunities, those still remain. And so you've got to be resilient and agile enough to be alive and vigilant to those opportunities when they're presented. So I like the way Ansie put it, is that maybe the perspectives and the focus points have changed somewhat, but I think that the issues, the filters through which we look at things might be different. And of course, the technology governance is a big one. I'm not going to go into that too much now, but the reality is that what we should have been doing before, we've now discovered that either we're doing well and were doing well, or we were clueless on certain boards. And so we have an opportunity, but that is never going to change. Just like risks never fall off a risk register, the company just gets better and more mature in terms of responding to them. Thanks, Juanita.
Thanks, Faye. Ralph, last but definitely not least, you are going to hold this against me. We're going to have a chat and a coffee afterwards. Your opinion on what boards should still be focusing on, and maybe some of the areas that you've seen boards fail pre-pandemic that they need to catch up on.
Okay. Juanita, I think quite a lot's been said, so I'm not going to repeat some of those issues. But I think just to build on the concept of strategy, it doesn't change. However, everything flows from strategy. So what has changed since COVID or during COVID. So is the strategy still relevant? I think that's one of the majors, because that then flows into, and I think Faye's point about the board shorts and e-commerce, it's a fundamental change in business. We saw Musica shut its doors. That wasn't COVID related. It had happened a long time prior. It was just a downward slope that they were on. But everything flows out of strategy. So your risks flow out of strategy. And that's the base that I think has to be revisited. Are you still relevant in where you started out? And that relates into your target markets, the type of business, the risks will all flow out of that. When it comes to, I think the last thing I'd really like to just build on that is a couple of learnings out of COVID. Again, it's been touched on, but cash or debt. I mean, when COVID happened, we shut the doors and we said, cash is the most important thing. Why? Because it's the only way you're going to survive a major shock. And, you know, we all look at it and governance tells you. We teach it all the time or facilitate it, saying, can your organization survive a major shock? And the only way you're going to survive that if your balance sheet is strong enough. I heard Grant Patterson the other night on an interview where he actually turned around and said, until you're in that position, when he moved into EdCon, and your business starts operating profitably, but yet you cannot survive because of the level of debt. Now, partly COVID result, a lot of the debt was raised before COVID, but don't build your balance sheet structure on normality. You have to have something in reserve. And then the other point, sorry, just one more point on that was made, is you need to look. So often as boards we sit down, and very often it's around Robin resolution, which I hate. But they come around and say, sign off a guarantee as the holding company for the subsidiary company for certain debt. Yeah, I've got lots of money, I can do this. I sign off, and so it goes on. And it actually shocks me the number of companies that do that. Pay attention to those guarantees. Be vigilant before you sign and understand what you're signing. The last point I just wanted to touch on was compliance. And I mean, I came across a terrible experience where TERS came to the fore. Now, if you're going to apply in terms of the relief scheme, understand the legislation. And again, people did not do that. As boards, we sat back and didn't pay enough attention, in my view, to what was going on in the subsidiaries. And in one of the companies, we stumbled across, I think it was close to 10 million sitting in an account, whereas legislation tells you quite clearly, 2 days to pay the money out, 5 days to send through your proof of payment, and 10 days to return everything that's not being used. That money was sitting in the account for 3 months. Now, it was separate, it was isolated. The CEO, CFO said, well, we isolated it, the interest will go back to UIF. But the reality is, it can become an absolute reputational nightmare. Every day we open the newspapers, TERS, who's taking advantage, who has scammed the system. You don't want to be caught up in those sorts of things. So compliance is critical. Just because it opens up, and it's no excuse, ignorance of the law. The disciplinaries that we ran, their defense was ignorance. Not acceptable. I'm not a lawyer, but I can see Faye has said that ignorance is not a defense. Those were the learnings that I just wanted to add to the other two.
Thanks, Ralph. Ansie, if I had it correctly, you had your hand raised for a comment. So I'll allow it, and then I want to ask my burning question back to Ralph as well. But Ansie, you first. Just on mute. Ansie, please unmute.
Oh,
there you go.
I found what Ralph said very interesting, and Faye also alluded to it. And there's just an interesting statistic that I want to share with our audience on the pivoting aspect. Pivoting. Dell Technologies Digital Transformation Index for 2020 indicates that the that 84% of South African companies that were surveyed, and they surveyed 5,300 C-suite respondents from 23 countries. But in South Africa, 84% of companies reinvented their business models as a result of COVID. That is very interesting. You know, referring to the beach shorts example, and Ralph, your point that you know we need to, it will impact on our strategy, this experience that we've been through. I just wanted to highlight that.
Ralph, in terms of board composition then, are small boards then still the right thing to do in terms of board composition? Because you should now have a compliance specialist, and you should have a legal specialist, and you should have an HR specialist, and a comms specialist, and a reputation specialist, and loads of finance specialists. Should board composition change in the face of everything we've learned during the pandemic? Or do you think King 4's recommendations still stand?
I think King 4 still stands. You know, a board, bearing in mind that a board has oversight, you don't, if you need expertise in the business, it needs to be in the executive, not on the board. There needs to be an understanding on the board. But essentially, boards are monitoring trends, or monitoring you know, implementation, compliance. But as non-execs, we're not being called into the business to recommend what you should and shouldn't be doing. We're testing what the executives are doing and asking questions, looking at it from a different angle. So I'm very much in support of you must have competence, but I don't think you need to go overboard with saying, you know, I've got to have an IT specialist, or I need to have a compliance specialist. That sits within the organization. You need to get feedback that those things are being done. So I have no problem with the composition as King describes it.
Then Faye, for you, a follow-up question. If we then keep our board composition the same, if one of the learnings isn't change your entire your board as a knee-jerk reaction and get all of these specialists on, how can existing boards upskill themselves and remind themselves to ask these questions and learn how to ask the right questions from the experts at the right time, so that they are prepared at all times, so that they don't get caught in ignorance?
Well, with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I'm going to say that they shouldn't be on that board if they are not doing those things already, because that is a key characteristic and a key indicator of a competent director and a competent board, is that you interrogate and you probe and you investigate and you assure yourself through a series of events and undertaking processes that you are happy with what is being presented to you and you're happy to support it. And it goes to Ralph's point around guarantees, etc. And the very serious decisions that are round robin, it's unacceptable, actually, and unforgivable, if we're completely honest, given the consequence of these decisions. So the thing that I just wanted to make the point is I'm becoming increasingly concerned at this knee-jerk response that is taking place in different boards, and it's cross-border as well, not just locally. And it is being positioned as a response to COVID in terms of some of the fault lines that have surfaced. And one of those is, of course, we need to be more sensitive to the risks, and that is the opportunities and threats. And one of the big ticket items, of course, and people are still using 4IR, which is so outdated, is technology governance and disruption and cybersecurity. And it goes back, if I look at, talk to Ralph and Ansie, 10, 20, 30 years even, when we were talking about disruption generally versus optimization. And now when we ask, whether you're sitting on an audit committee or a board, if you ask for a business continuity plan, you get given a disaster recovery plan. so too everybody's focused now on cybersecurity and information security, data privacy, etc. And so that's what's being parachuted on the board. Oh my goodness, look what's happening. We're at risk, we're exposed, we're vulnerable. So let's quickly appoint some data or technological specialist on the board. That's the wrong answer, because then you're going to get this voluminous board. And I'm using that example, but it's the same thing we had with any perceived change in the contextual reality. And so boards are still not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is to give that oversight, to upskill themselves, first of all, and understand what we're dealing with. So again, and not just because it's the IoDSA, but commit yourself to your own personal continuing professional development program. Attend the IoD sessions, because what we're saying is, whether it is on cybersecurity or whether it is on, Ansie's running a program on Tongaat and African Bank, etc., is at director level. What are the questions you should be asking? What are the things you should be raising? And that is a skill, that interrogatory thinking, that critical analysis, deductive reasoning, application of logic and rationality. That is a skill that you need to build. It doesn't matter what the subject matter or the content is. So I think it is key to accept, first of all, that a good director is only she who continues to learn and being open to being teachable and accepting that you cannot know everything. That's the first thing. The second thing is to appreciate that a director basket of skills is something you need to train and learn for. So a good accountant, a good engineer, a good lawyer does not a good director make. That is something critical. And all of that feeds into then, where is the board going? Ralph talked again about strategy. There's a good few of our clients at the moment who have ended some of their strategic cycles and they're starting again. So is your board fit for purpose to take the company to where it needs to go? And if you are going to pivot, and if you now have made peace with the fact that you are an e-commerce company and not just selling board shorts, then obviously you are going to need different skills on the board versus just being a simple traditional retail establishment. And those are the questions that you need to ask. And those are questions that we've always encouraged people to ask. I do think, just to make the point, because of the issues that have been thrown up with COVID, that you need to strengthen your governance framework, and that talks to your policies and procedures, but clearly it talks to integrated reporting at all levels. And we can touch on integrated thinking and the journey later on, but it's to hold your executives accountable and to ask your executives to report in a more formal manner to the board, and how you always measure then performance against objectives on every single agenda, irrespective throughout the organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. Ansie and Ralph, I see you've both been nodding and agreeing with what Faye is saying. Would you like to add to anything that she's mentioned? Ansie.
I think Faye has said it well. And Rolf as well. You don't need an expert you don't need to mirror on your board the expertise that the company requires. The company within its management has the expertise. What the board members must be experts in governance and in oversight. And I often find, and Faye, you've referred to it, I often find that very experienced business people in an executive capacity, it's not a seamless transition from that to being a non-executive director. As a non-executive director, you must make peace with the fact that you are not close to the happenings on a day-to-day basis at the company. You cannot compete with management in terms of the knowledge that management possesses, the intimate, detailed knowledge. You cannot compete, and you should not try, because the fact that you further removed is actually a benefit, but it's only a benefit if you harness it. as a benefit. So you need to be an expert at wielding your corporate governance tools. If you don't understand what combined assurance is and how you can wield it as a tool, you have no business being a non-executive director. And I tell you, if you say that to many non-executive directors, they become cross-eyed because they don't know what you're talking about. You have no business as to be a non-executive director if you don't know how to ask the right questions, even in respect of a field that is not your expertise. You need to be able to, that's part of wielding your governance tools. And that's an expertise that you need to develop alongside your technical expertise.
And I think that's one of the lessons that many boards have learned during the past year or about a year ago, is that they thought they had good people on a board, and good people turned out to not be enough from a governance and an oversight perspective. Ralph, you unmuted yourself, so I'm assuming you've got something great to say.
Yeah, I just, well, I don't know about the great part, but just a practical example, I think, to explain what's being put on the table is, you know, we sit at a board and we say, right, we need to hack into the system, unbeknown to everybody, to see how fast we detect the hack and how we can shut it down, isolate it, etc., etc. The first response you'll get very often from executive, we must do it Saturday morning at 11:45 when things are nice and quiet. Well, that's the wrong thing. You've got to do it at a peak time. Hackers don't sit around waiting for you to be quiet. So do it at a peak time, as disruptive as it is. Those are the sorts of things that, you know, boards need to be commenting on and, you know, forcing those sorts of issues through, even though it is disruptive to the company.
Thanks, Ralph. During your first round of comments, you said that liquidity and cash was one of the big lessons that many companies had to learn, and that we can't dare to forget. We can't go back into a debt spiral now just because pandemic is over. And you said cybersecurity. So one of the lessons we can keep on learning and enable ourselves to not forget is to hack the company during the busiest time. What are some of the other lessons and potentially practical examples of how we as directors can stress test policies, procedures, processes, and so on that we've set during busy times to prepare ourselves based on the lessons learned during the pandemic?
Yeah, Juanita, I'm not sure I have a hell of a lot to add there, but you know, the reality is I think we just have to be realistic in our thinking and be as practical as we can. So it's going to differ from company to company, depending on what your business is, what you do, how you do it, all those sorts of things. Bearing in mind that even, you know, we talk about IT as a disruptor, as it can change the face of business, but it depends whether IT is an enabler or if it is your core business. If it's your core business, you better be at the cutting edge. If it's an enabler, you can be a follower. So people don't have to stress and get caught up in, what does one call it? It's fashionable at the moment to talk about the disruptor. It doesn't mean it's going to disrupt your business, but a board needs to consider it and say, well, there's nothing wrong with being a close follower. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind at the end of the day. So generalizations or rules don't apply to everybody in the same way. Understand your strategy, understand your core competencies. And I always differentiate between core competencies and business imperatives. Business imperatives, you can change, you can be second, you can be third, it doesn't matter. You'll just be slightly less efficient. Core competencies are critical because they relate to your strategy, and those are your differentiators. So understand your strategy, focus, understand your core competencies, and if boards have that full understanding, they then start off the same base for all the discussions. Otherwise, you find we have discussions and we start talking past each other. And 9 times out of 10, it's because we're not coming off the same base. And, you know, I think that just became a little more obvious during COVID. But more than that, I think it's specific per company you need to understand.
Thanks, Ralph. And it speaks to the one lesson that I remember from you when I did my certified director designation training. You were my facilitator, and there's one thing that Ralph said that always stuck in my mind, and I've been using it and attributing it to him. And Ralph said, don't get seduced by all opportunities. It's easy to do. It was easy last year. It will remain easy as new things come along, as new trends come along. Remember Ralph's words, do not be seduced by all opportunities. So thanks for that. Those words of wisdom. I'm thinking about how many years, 5 years ago, I think it is now. Faye, you've been nodding crazily. Go for it. Unmute yourself and then give us your opinion on the lessons learned and what we should do to not forget them.
Yeah, just before I do, I want to say, based on our session yesterday, that you see, Ralph, you are the favorite, hands down. Okay. So just a few things. I think that you were asking about practical things in terms of stress testing. So the first thing, and one of my business partners always says it, and I can't remember it right now, but it's got to do with, you know, profit, something being vanity, etc., and then there's sanity, but cash being reality. And every business owner, and ideally, even in the big corporates, you should have a solid entrepreneur somewhere in the top tier. Every business owner knows that cash is the reality of it. And so that's why you manage your cash flows every day, and you should know what's going on in your business irrespective. So with COVID presenting itself and the need for us to be able to assess quickly what the liquidity is and how we, oh, thank you, Vinod, thank you. That is it, and I love it, so for us to have access to the liquidity, because we didn't know, and again, I'm going to park whether we should have or shouldn't have, because that's another discussion, but a lot of companies or organizations were not adequately prepared. And because of the need for remote working or introducing new sanitizing and other COVID-19 requirements within the organization or whatever it is, and whether it was tech, employee wellness, etc., and all the levels or the systems, you needed access to cash. And so a lot of companies were maybe found wanting. And because your financial institutions themselves are an organization and under pressure, they weren't easily increasing overdrafts or access bonds, etc., etc. So that, when you talk about a fault line, you know, whilst we must understand that we need to appreciate the ecosystem in which we operate in its entirety, that if you don't have enough money to run, then you are not sustainable, you're not focusing on the sustainability, and then you shouldn't be on the board, because that is a key indicator in terms of success, along with all the others. So it's not a hierarchy, etc. In terms of that, though, that is the indicator. Every business has a value chain or a service line offering. And most of these are fairly pedestrian and fairly common, irrespective of the size of the balance sheet, the footprint, the number of employees, etc., of an organization. So to stress test a system, you should put pressure on the system in each of those nodes. And in order to understand whether or not the organization is sufficiently resilient and agile, which is really what the board should be testing on an ongoing basis, you will see how you respond in those different nodes. So I've talked about finance. I'll just, for the purposes of time, give one other. Is your customer kind of, you know, your comments, complaints, compliments kind of engagement, or your customer interface. Do you know how many organizations who are seen to be successful don't spend sufficient time on client retention And like Ralph says, in terms of being seduced by opportunity, spend a lot of time on client acquisition and forget about the clients that they have and how they can take care of them. Or better still, if you've got clients or customers that have been with you for a while, to reach out and ask them what is good, what is not so good, and be open to it, and be open to pivoting there, because that should be, it's an iterative process. An organization, a company is alive, it's dynamic, it keeps moving. So you need to be open to those things, and that's how you stress test. Now, I see one or two individuals in our audience today who used to work with me in one of my previous CEO positions. And so they know that I'm very fond of stress testing my own system. Of course, it's easier when I'm in the CEO position, maybe less so when I'm sitting in a chair. But I like the concept of having a secret someone. So you know how you have a secret diner where you go and assess a restaurant and see if they really are all that. So I had introduced a secret client, and I can't share anymore because otherwise I'll compromise the company, but where a client called up to be put onto the system, and whether or not their experience was what we were marketing and pitching as what would be the way things operated. So there's those different methods, and if those reports get put up to the board, get sent up to the board, that's how you stress test, and that is how you actually assess whether what you're being told is what is actually being delivered and what is happening, and then that gap between the way it should be and the way it is can be closed. Thanks,
and in my experience, that gap is a lot more valuable than just getting full marks on everything. I've sat on boards and I've consulted to boards where they strive to get 100% customer satisfaction or 100% of this, or they design surveys, they design feedback, they design tests so they can get better scores. And then I went in and said, no, if you ask people, they will tell you for free what's wrong with your company. Then your strat session work is kind of done because you don't have to go through the whole SWOT analysis. People will tell you if you ask them, and if you're willing to listen to things that you might not like, but that is extremely valuable for the growth in the end. Ansie, tying into the lessons and what Faye said, now I'd like to ask you a somewhat pointed question. You're welcome to deflect it if you want. But Faye talked about customers and communicating with them. What about all of the other stakeholders, including institutional shareholders and regular shareholders, all of the other stakeholders and communication? What are some of the lessons that you think companies and boards specifically have learned during the pandemic that should not be forgotten and deserves more attention? If you're okay with that question.
Of course. So the trick with your stakeholders is that as a company, you always want your stakeholders to have confidence in you and trust in you, regardless of their particular expectation. And the last thing, a stakeholder doesn't want to get the sense that you're losing control of the situation. And that is why that scenario testing, stress testing your company is so very important, because you will give the impression that you've given, that you've lost control if you've not done the work pre the crisis. You know, we can talk about a flock of black swans. We can talk about whether COVID was a black swan. Nassim Taleb, who made the term popular, he says it wasn't a black swan. But that's not actually the point. There's no risk management system that will be able to predict all the unknowns that may materialize. There's no such risk management system. So what you need to appreciate as management and as the board, that unknowns will happen and will materialize. So your duty with regards to that is twofold. Firstly, you need to make sure that you address your biases and your blind spots. Now, what I mean by that is, if I can use the example of climate change. Climate change is not new. It's not unknown. There's no uncertainty about it. And yet, many companies are, it's been known for decades, many companies are shockingly unprepared for it. Why is that? So that's the one duty of board and management, to make sure that those certainties, we just don't know exactly when and how they will materialize and impact. We need to be ready for them. But then there are the true black swans, those things that we cannot actually predict. And how you shock-proof yourself against that is the liquidity cash point that's been made. It is by being resilient. It's by having contingencies in place. The only way that you can do that is through scenario planning. And the scenario planning should ask questions like, what if there's a sustainable lack of income or resource, or lack of income or revenue? What if there's a disruption in our supply chain? Doesn't matter what the cause is. You don't have to identify the exact cause. You must work from the consequence end and see if you can absorb the consequence. Okay. So if you've done that work, sorry, I'm giving you a long-winded answer. But
oh no, I'm loving this answer. You're introducing the next section perfectly, so go for it.
So if you've done the work to be as ready as you can be for these shocking uncertainties, these huge disruptors, then you can immediately jump in action when they happen. And of course, your responses will not be perfect, and nobody expects them to be perfect, but you can evidence and demonstrate to your shareholders and your other stakeholders that you've got a plan and you've got things in hand. And of course, I don't think this will come as news. Communication. And this is where I think COVID introduces a little bit of a different skill set. Again, maybe different is the wrong word. It's not different, but more of an emphasis, more nuanced, and an emphasis on our leaders having to be agile, having to be able to think on their feet, be able to deal with change, and be socially adept, and be able to connect, be able to communicate. I think those so-called soft skills that have the hard consequences have become critically important. And I think our companies, and I'm veering off a little bit, I think our companies, when you look at talent management, that should be an absolute focus point. We focus very much on developing technical skills, and they are very important, but they need to be supplemented with these EQ type of skills. If you just look at your CEO, for example, I know of a CEO who a big company in the UK who told the workforce, the employees, that they had to basically grin it and bear it because he's now tired of their complaints. He's no longer the CEO of that company. and he was somebody with an excellent reputation, excellent competency levels, but that lack of empathy cost him his position.
There has definitely
Thanks.
been a shift. We've seen it already in terms of the EQ and the different skills and what's being required of leaders and so on. We've seen it kind of grow, but there was space for resistance still at the top. There was space for resistance. We don't need it now. We're at the top of our game. We don't need to change. We're still making money, etc., etc. And the pandemic that just said now, just now, you've got no excuses anymore. You've resisted for so long. Now you've got to bring all of these soft skills with the hard consequences. You've got to bring them in the fold. You've got to pay attention to them. Two things I like very much what you said: communication, very obviously, because I'm a communicator at heart and by trade. But what I also, like you said, is people don't expect you to be perfect. It's a fallacy we need to get over. Times have changed. People respect and reward authenticity and honesty and openness and transparency and immediacy a lot more than perfection. So whereas the more traditional core competencies set you up for doing everything perfectly, but no one kind of knew about it. Now it's about being agile, being resilient, trying things and being honest when you succeed, being honest when you fail, being honest when you should be doing better. And Ansie did a perfect introduction to the next section, so I'm not going to. She shared a little bit of what we should be focusing 2021 and beyond. Ralph, your thoughts on focus areas, specific governance focus areas for 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to, in some ways, where we started. I think the first and foremost is test the validity of the strategy, because that is your starting point. So what's changed out there? And I always like to look at it in 3 blocks: the company. So you look at your strategic intent. Is it still valid? Now, in order to test it, you have to go to the macro environment. The macro environment is all your compliance stuff. I call it the uncontrollables. Okay? You have no control over the interest rates. You have no control over all the laws and regulations. They are there. You have to comply. You have to adapt. So what's changed there, and fully understand those changes. And then the third block in the middle is your target market. Segment it, fragment it, understand it as best you can. Having said that, you will never understand it 100%. And that's the flexibility that comes in. So you feed all of that into the company. Is your strategy still valid? Understand the gaps, understand the strengths and weaknesses of the company, the opportunities and threats, tie them together and develop those short-term strategies. I still call them the Louis Allen sort of action plans, just to separate the terminology of strategy, long-term and short-term. And these things are changeable. So develop them and implement them. But then it's the board's job, and I think more focus has to be put on that from boards, is that every board meeting, you want feedback on the 3 or 4 biggest short-term strategies that are being implemented. Are they working? Aren't they working? If they're not working, why not? If you've misread the market, and I think it goes back to what Ansie was saying, can it? It's not an embarrassment to say, that's what I wanted to do. I found out I'm wrong. It's better to do it after 6 months than to wait another whole year for a process. Lots of them will just need small adjustments, but at least you're monitoring and you're keeping pressure on the executive as well, oversight in terms of pushing those things through. If boards focus on those issues operationally, you're going to cover a lot of ground that you need to cover. Otherwise, I don't think a hell of a lot has changed. Risks all flow out of strategy. So if your strategy is relevant, your markets, you understand your markets, you've read them as best you can, your strategies flow from that. Keep on monitoring them, keep on top of them. And I like the stress test as not so much a stress test, but testing it. And a very practical way is, they always say non-execs don't get too close to the business, but you need to visit operations. I'm of the mode that I like to go to one of the outlying operations or to a factory, not with the CEO, because otherwise they want to know what you want for lunch and they clean the front patio, etc., etc. You arrive there and you announce yourself and somebody takes you around. One of the first questions I always ask is, what is your biggest risk? And understand how they've rated it, impact and likelihood, or whatever the terminology they're using. What is its score? Because you've been told at the board that it's been driven through the organization. Very practical way. Don't interfere, even if they give you the wrong answer. Your feedback is back to the CEO. But a practical way, if it's been driven through, they will be aware of those biggest risks. And I think it's not being closer to the detail, because it's not a non-exec's job to be that close to the detail. But what you're monitoring, what you're managing, test. And boards need to do that more. Don't just rock up to the 8th floor once a quarter.
And if I may add to that, hoping to win, wishing to win, striving to win, but also being able to be agile and just fail, just decide to fail, just decide to put it to bed because it's not working, and do that a lot quicker.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if one other term, you had that long list of adjectives just now, and I don't know half the words you use, but I'll look them up afterwards. But another one to add is vulnerability. You know, particularly CEOs, they don't want to be vulnerable, but you must be vulnerable because then you can surround yourself with people who have those strengths. So admit your weaknesses. There's no problem. Faye's about the only person who continuously tells me she's perfect.
Well, then let's go to our perfect panelist, Faye, and open the floor for your perfect comments, please.
Why I adore you, Ralph. Why I adore you. You know, Ralph captures things so eloquently always and practically and takes us to the heart of things. So I just want to deal with something up front. The first is COVID could not have been a black swan. That's my opinion. And it couldn't have been a flock of black swans either, because this shouldn't have been news to us. It should have been on our risk registers somewhere, and depending on the type of organization, obviously it would have been prioritized accordingly. For some organizations, it might not have featured, but it's a possibility. And so that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to just tag onto, which Ralph had mentioned, was the idea of, and Ansie mentioned it too, is the idea of being agile and what COVID has done. And so we keep getting caught up in this COVID story, okay? And I don't want to negate any of it. However, all it has done is given us a snapshot and a moment in time which showed us through a series of occurrences and events, tragic in certain instances, as to how unprepared we are. That is the reality of it. And so the issue is around, when it comes to strategy, and Ralph talked about, you know, the reporting on the long-term and short-term strategy, I always talk about performance against objectives, which has to be how we are doing. And I prefer dashboard reporting, but the reality is that when it comes to risk, which is pre-COVID, during, post, and beyond, when we're all pushing up daisies, is whether or not we have completely applied our minds, internalized, and are comfortable with the things which will impact our achievement of our strategic objectives positively and negatively. That's risk. There's nothing pejorative about it. It's opportunities and threats. And the two examples that I always like to go back to, and just, I suppose, a nod to Tony Dixon, who I always feel his presence at these things. Tony taught us all about, you know, Kubernetes and the captain steering a ship. And it's the reason that the captain, AKA the board, has to be on deck is you've got to be able to see the iceberg or the tsunami or the fabulous tropical island where you can, you know, stop and get fresh water and fresh pineapples, for example. You've got to be there scanning the horizon. And so this idea of COVID is something that impacted us achieving our strategic objectives. Either we were able to pivot and achieve it, or we were not. So I think it really showed it up. In terms of our inability to be prepared, or we just were not prepared. The other thing that I think we should let go, and I suppose I'm going to challenge all of us, you know, the 192 participants and the 6 or 7 of us. let's stop talking about failure, because what's happened is failure was bad, you shouldn't fail, you must just work hard to avoid failure. Then there was this iteration of, no, fail, because that's the good steps to success. You know, that's how you teach children agility and resilience, etc. I'm saying, because fail is so burdened that you can default to the negative, changing direction and being dynamic is key. So if we decide that we are going to go on an aggressive acquisition path, and that's our strategy, and we discover that the target company that we were going to buy, post the due diligence or whatever, just isn't what we had anticipated, and so it has a huge impact on our strategic direction, then we adjust. That's not failing. That's not, to say we got it wrong isn't a bad thing. That in itself is not a failure. What that is, in fact, shows that there is a very committed, focused, clear application of mind, and being open to, when you either discover more information, when you interrogate further, or when new pieces of information surface, and to be able to access that and then feed it back into the system and maneuver accordingly, I think is key. So when we undertake board performance evaluations, for example, a lot of companies do fairly okay with your strategic direction, strategic planning. Where a lot of boards fall flat on their faces, and again, part of our being practitioners, we are on some of those boards that maybe didn't do as well as they could have, which is why you need to be open and vulnerable about it. But where boards fall flat on their faces is in terms of the monitoring and the taking time as corrective action. And the reason for that is, if you are not alive to what is going on and this constant changing environment, whether it's artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, or climate change, or diversity and inclusion matters, whatever it is, if you're not alive to the way things are changing around you and factor that change into how the organization has to adjust to either adapt or adjust its strategic objectives, or in terms of the route we are taking to get there, and being open to say, you know what, I'm not going there because I'm heading straight into a tsunami. I'm rather, it sounds weird because I'm now going to have to go all around the globe, but that makes more sense. Why? Because the risks are too high there versus the reward. And if I go around, it'll take longer. We might have to do with less fresh fruit and vegetables, but I can guarantee that the ship will be sound and the crew will be alive and we will still be standing. So for me, those are the lessons. And you know, I'm almost asking us to adult up, because this is stuff that we would be doing naturally, that we do every day in our lives. You know, go for an advanced driver's course so that when it starts raining, that you know what to do. You know, and it's, again, not only to, I should never use the driving example because then people go back into risk as being bad, but adult up, really, COVID or not COVID. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Faye. Ralph, I see what she does. She doesn't just say she's perfect, she proves how wrong we are. So, you know, you and I saying, you know, we should be able to fail fast and we should admit to fail, that's wrong. We should just change direction a lot quicker, as per the comments as well. And talking about the comments, we have a lot of questions coming in. So, dear panelists, for the next 20 minutes, please, I would like your closing comments on the things. Faye said something that the pandemic shouldn't have been news to us. So what else shouldn't be news to us in the next 1, 3, 5, and 10 years? If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer that was just released, people demand now that CEOs take a stance. 59% of the people responding said that CEOs must talk about and take a stance on the pandemic impact. 43% of respondents CEOs must talk about societal issues. 51% CEOs must talk about job automation, and 40% CEOs must talk about local community issues. Those are just some of the examples, and things like artificial intelligence and cybersecurity and ESG and climate change and focus on culture and human resources have popped up in this conversation, but almost in a bulleted list format. What would be your top things that boards, Edelman Trust Barometer told us what CEOs should be focusing on, but what should boards in bullet format put on the board agenda and keep on the board agenda for the next 10 years odd? Ansie, and then Ralph, and then Faye.
I think boards should be very careful to silo things, and we should be the skill that boards and management of company or leadership should develop, governments in fact as well, is we should become experts in systems thinking and in complexity and how things work together. And be careful not to see them as silos, because then I think we're going to miss some of the trick. And perhaps I can illustrate it with an example. A new story that I read in the past 2 weeks in Financial Mail, and it's about what happened with the liquid gas production in Mozambique. And to me, when I read it, it was so striking as to how different issues culminate. So I'll quickly, and I hope I remember everything, but how it happened was in about 2015, predictions of fabulous wealth for Mozambique were made because of its liquid gas resources. And so many energy companies invested in infrastructure in Mozambique, and it was anticipated that in 2019, huge profits will start to be generated. But the reality is far from it, and it's because of a culmination of events. The one is that gas was seen as a transitional fuel because its greenhouse emission is about half that of traditional fossil fuel. But last year, environmentalists started moving against all types of fossil fuel, including gas. Okay, so that was the one nail in the coffin of the gas stream. Then what happened was when these predictions were made, China was seen as a big buyer of the gas that was produced, because China has given certain commitments to move away from coal fire stations, and therefore, because gas is more environmentally friendly, would become a user of gas as a transitional move. But because of global politics, Mozambique is seen as an ally of the US, and because of those deteriorating relationships, China opted to go to Qatar, and Iran, I think, is the other country, and rather buy their gas from there. Then, because of those two factors, the global market moved against, or the global market for gas reduced. So globally, there was just not as much of a market, because gas was now lumped with other fossil fuels as bad for the environment, and so the market closed up. And then lastly, then there is the civil unrest and the civil war that surged again in Mozambique. And as a result of safety concerns, Total, as one example, withdrew completely from Mozambique. So you can see, if you, as say, for example, you Total, you made this huge infrastructure investment over years. At the moment they've withdrawn, lost that whole investment without a short-term prospect of ever winning it back. So you can see, as a board, if you look at things in isolation, civil unrest and social issues, insurgency as one thing, or you looked at the global politics as one thing, or you looked at what stakeholders and civil society and your shareholders are now demanding with regards to ESG issues, and particularly climate change, you would have missed the trick. But you have to be able to work with complexity and systems and see that. So that's again a long-winded way just to say, be careful of having an agenda item on ESG and break it up: climate change, society, the market, economics. Be careful of breaking it up like that, and rather have that more strategic lens on that more. And this is where Bob Garrett, the person who wrote The Fish Rots from the Head, which is, I think, his most famous, he always talked about director's homework. And this falls squarely for me within that director's homework. When you come to the boardroom, don't come with the silo mentality. Come with do your homework so that you understand the operating environment in all of its complexity and dynamics very well, so that when you contribute on these particular agenda items, that you are able to do it from a place of depth and breadth. Okay, so that's actually only my introduction. So I'm only going to say one agenda point. Culture, organizational culture. This is something that is critical to move forward and to keep an eye on. We can have all of these ambitions and lofty ideals about agility, about pivoting, about knowing the purpose, why we exist. But if that is not reflected in the corporate culture, you may as well, you're not even getting out of the starting blocks. Culture, behavior is what they call your orange flag before you get the red flag. Culture is your leading indicator. And it's not correct that you can't influence culture and that you can't work towards the sort of culture that you want. But again, directors and management must do their homework so that they know how it is done. You can do it and you must do it. So my short answer is culture.
Thank you very much for the short answer and the really good sketch of the lens we should be looking at, because I do think it matters. It helps to have a list, but if you look at that list from the wrong angle, you're going to get it wrong, because then it's the tick box approach again. And as we all know, governance is not just about compliance. Governance is not about ticking the boxes. It's about understanding it in the greater ecosystem, the word I learned from you, Ansie. Also very important that you are saying culture. What I notice about governance trends is humans, from a board perspective, is not just about numbers anymore. Humans are about humanity and being human, and boards should be paying attention to how much the company allows humans to be human, how much they train humans to function and operate in the system they set up. Humans aren't cogs anymore, they're actual humans, and that's maybe one of the things that board should make a shift on. So now we have the lens, we've got the picture, we've got the you should do it in all systems thinking, but please add to Ansie's short answer, Ralph, with however long you want to answer.
Okay, I'm not going to go into everything we've covered in terms of, you know, the reset of strategy and everything else, but just two sort of concepts that I'd like to think board should be very aware of, and it's actually there was a book written by a guy by the name of Friedman who said, "Thanks for being late." And 2 points come out, which for me were just so strong in his writing. One is, life is a merry-go-round today. We sit with cell phones, tablets, wherever you go, and you're expected to be on call 24 hours a day. And he just says, get off of that merry-go-round and reflect. Reflect on what's going on. And a board needs to do that as a team, not just every second year with the review of how you're going, but just sitting back and saying, are we doing the right things? Are we focused on the right things? And we have more than one member on the board because it's not individual thinking, it's the combined thinking of the total board, which then leads you into, have you got the right people on the board? And we touched on it at the start. You don't want a knee-jerk reaction of getting specialists. You want all-rounders that meet those needs of whichever industry you're operating in. Friedman also spoke about the pace of technology, being exponential, and his view is that the line has crossed between the change in technology and the individual's ability to change. So the restricting factor is now the individual, not the technology. So again, but it depends on what industry you're in, where you're operating. Don't have, and I've got to be careful here, don't have people who are 70 plus, because I'm not 70 yet, you see. Don't have 7 directors of 70 plus. I'm not saying you can't have some 70-year-olds on the board, but don't have 7, because you'll start hearing the comment about, in my day, we did it this way. Please print my board pack. Those are things you've got to be careful of. So you must have diversity, but not diversity for the sake of diversity, diversity for the sake of having the right people on the right board with the right view. If you're a high-risk company, have a culture of high risk. Don't put in a person who's risk averse. And that's the mix that you've got to look at. So diversity on a board is far greater than just color and age and everything else. It meets all those issues, because I believe color and age are actually factors in understanding the market today, not just having the right distribution. So please be aware of those.
Thanks
That's
very
my
much,
short
Ralph.
answer.
Is that the short answer? Don't have old people on boards. No, that's not what Ralph is saying, but Ralph is saying make sure that diversity is a key issue, not a tick box exercise, not so that you can get the tenders, but investors are more and more asking for what your diversity policy across all of these demographics are. So not just for now, but what is your plan to diversify your board so that you diversify your thinking? Thanks very much, Ralph. Faye, your closing comments, please.
Well, now, after such perfection, Ralph, how am I supposed to achieve anything? So just a few things from my side, and I'm going to keep it a little fairly practical and almost bullet pointed. The first thing that I'd like to talk to all of us here as individuals, as directors or aspiring directors or directors who should now say goodbye, so that I'm not being ageist, but for a variety of reasons. The first thing I think that some of the lessons to learn or some of the takeaways from all of this recent change and turbulence and madness is that we need to read, to understand, and to learn more. If there's one thing that directors need to do more of, and it is in line with what Ralph was saying around the take time to reflect and introspect, I call it professional pause. Take the time. You're not doing anybody any favors if you think or believe you are too busy to do it. Because if you're too busy to do it, then you have no business being on any board or being in a position where you are making huge decisions which have huge consequence and impact on so many people's lives. And there's I'll try and find it. My son actually shared it with me. I don't know if it was him trying to subtly message me, but it's a podcast on the Teachability Index, and whether as adults, how teachable we are, and whether we are able to learn new things, be open to change and to considering other things. So that for me is critical, because that feeds into, I've seen a lot of questions around, should the board do this, should management do that? And it's one of the things that keeps coming up is the blurring of lines and not understanding roles and responsibilities, and also continuing professional development and skills development. I think that's that basket. The second one is stakeholder mapping, and I'm not seeing it being done as robustly in our organizations as they should be. Understanding the different stakeholders in your ecosystem or your universe, but mapping them in a way that you understand very clearly as to what their hot button issues are, because that then talks to how you produce your integrated reporting, how you report in terms of ESG, etc. And to Ansie's point in Mozambique, just to take that forward a little bit, we've seen how, as your contextual situational reality changes outside of you, how if you have not been agile and resilient enough to change, we all know, and we use the term quite loosely, that we mustn't be Ubered. But we've seen how all of those things can happen so quickly. And so that talks to whether it be racial or gender exclusion. It's no longer acceptable to exclude people on the basis of race or gender, but it was never okay. But now, because of the stakeholder activism, the citizenry activism, people are being held to account. We've seen even with the Standard Bank AGM recently, just to pick up on Ansie's, that whole fossil fuels issue. And you wait. I mean, everybody was talking about whether people should have had access to the AGM or not to participate in those discussions. Now, a few months later, you've seen the shift. So it's about mapping your stakeholders and understanding that you are not an island as an organization, and as the board being the mind of the company, you need to appreciate those sensitivities and that fluidity constantly. And that ties into the first point, which is if you don't read and you're not aware of what is happening in the world, then how are you ever going to offer any value whatsoever? The third, which I know is my kind of broken record, it'll be my swan song, I'm sure, is open your eyes and accept that risk is both opportunity and threat. That you need to look at this changing dynamic external to the business, how it impacts internally, and look at what the consequence and impact is on your strategic objectives, because that then talks to your ability to be prepared. That talks to whether or not you are resilient or agile, or like we've seen a lot of organizations are not. And that then, if you link it to the stakeholder mapping and the reading and CPD, etc., talks to whether or not as a board you are making decisions that contribute to the organization's sustainability and value creation. So whether you look at it again through a filter of climate change and ESG, diversity and inclusion, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, integrated reporting, are you creating value for all your stakeholders? That for me is key. The example that I shared with you guys yesterday, I know we said we'd touch on it, but it's really important for me, the Watson, the IBM computer, in terms of being able to, you can feed anything into Watson, and from a medical perspective, it will throw out a diagnosis, which is all well and good. But if you look at what's changing from a telemedicine, telehealth perspective, a more holistic, a more acceptance of holistic healing, not just pharma, pushing pharma, then you'll see that the skills that are required now for medical professionals going forward, while diagnostics will always be important, but empathy, bedside manner, compassion, the ability to listen, because your patient actually tells you a lot. But if you're so busy or so full of yourself, then you don't actually listen and you miss a lot. And so that's really important for me. We as directors, and I almost want us to have another session or put a program together, Ansie, on being directors in a time of disruption and whatever that means. And I think we'll all poke holes into this disruption. But it's this director in a VUCA world where with your volatility, your ambiguity, your uncertainty, complexity, etc. But if you just go back to basics, you know, what are the principles of governance, people, planet, prosperity? What is it that you want to achieve, and how best can you equip yourself, your board, and your organization to achieve it? And I'd like to just end off with three things. The first is that, I can't remember who said it, but is that a strong organization is one that can balance between continuity and change. So as individuals, we need to get accustomed to embracing change and not being afraid of it, because who you are as an individual translates into the boardroom, okay? What that calls on, and that is my message to each and every one of us, and that should be a mantra, is know thyself. Know thyself, challenge yourself, and remind yourself of what some of the issues are that you bring into the boardroom. Because you do bring in issues. Your personality introduces some challenges to those discussions. And at the end of the day, to thine own self be true, which is that you know whether you're doing wrong, you know whether you're doing right, and you know whether you prepared or whether you didn't. You know whether you could have done more, and you know whether you are honoring your legacy or just worrying about your board seat. Thanks, Juanita.
Thanks very, very much, Faye. Panelists, thank you so much. I think we can continue for another 3 hours, but since we've got a time limit and our delegates need to go back to the desk, and they've got quite a few burning questions, I'm going to close with piggybacking on Peter Drucker that said, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, I say, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, then feed culture a really good breakfast, informed by reading and learning and understanding. Thank you very much. You will now be put on the spot to answer a few delegate questions. The first one from Yang Gao, if I pronounce that correctly. With the implementation of King 4, have we observed an increase of resilience of South African business during this pandemic versus crisis in the past in other countries with different types of corporate governance, for example, the US? Ansie, all yours.
Sure, that's a difficult one. I think it's a correlation that, well, firstly, I think many South African companies did remarkably well in the face of the pandemic. And I was especially impressed with how actually companies were willing, hard-nosed corporate types were willing to support all of the communal and social efforts and challenges that we faced with the pandemic. So from that point of view, I think companies did well, and their posture and stance were really something to commend. I saw statistics the other day as to how much corporate donation was made in support of efforts that supported the societal issues as a result of the pandemic. And I can't remember the figures, but it's really remarkable. The next question is it as a result of King 4? I hope so, but I can't say so definitively. One of the characteristics of King 4 is, of course, and not only King 4, it's the whole King journey, right from King 1. King 1 included ethics where no other corporate code had it in. In King 2, we had the triple bottom line, where no other code looked at the E and the S, they only looked at the G. King 3 took that further, with its sustainability, its stakeholder inclusivity, etc., and its triple context, that triple context notion is still holding in King 4. So I hope that it is as a result of it, or at least partially as a result, but I can't say so for sure. I am, though, still disappointed in our companies apply King 4 generally. I'm not talking about COVID now. I do think there's a whole lot of box ticking still, that it's not appreciated, that it's about outcome, especially disclosure around King 4 application for me is particularly weak and disappointing.
Thanks very much, Ansie. Ralph, the next one is for you from Paco. As directors, are we not rendering the strategy irrelevant by dumping it onto management without proper oversight, both at the formulation and implementation stages?
Yeah. Again, I think it's all about the quality of the board. It can't be dumped down to management. It has to be approved. I think part of the problem is that boards, often non-executives, feel they should have more interaction, but I think it was Ansie said earlier, management will always, executives will always have a better understanding of the business. They're closer to the coalface, they know what's going on. The board's objective is to test what's being put in front of them in terms of those short-term strategies and the workability. Have they been assessed properly? That's the value. But at the end of the day, you get what you measure. Boards should be measuring the major strategies that are being implemented. They touched on, there's certain things that make a business tick, okay? And you need to be measuring that on an ongoing basis to make sure the business is going well. I came out of an industry as a CEO where there were 5 issues, plotted them on a graph for 3 years so you could see the trends and you knew exactly where you were. The strategies are the short term, take you from where you are to where you're going. So it's a combination, understand the roles. The executive implement, the board wants feedback. The board wants to see how you're feeding back. If it's measurable, is it working? How are you going against the actions, the timing, the results? All of those things need to be measured. But the biggest thing is, don't be afraid to change. Those strategies can be changed depending on if you've misread the market or misread something else, and no one must be embarrassed to admit that. So I think it's a combination of the two players, but the board must know their role. They're not just giving it to the executive. I think in some boards it does happen. You know, the document is pulled out a year later when we go back to the strategic session. That's wrong.
Thanks very much, Ralph. Faye, specifically for you, because your name is on here. Muketsi asks, oh, that disappeared just now. Hang on, Faye. Should the board take responsibility for ESG over and above integrated reporting?
So the board, in fulfilling its oversight role and acquitting itself of its fiduciary duty, needs to definitely provide the necessary guidance in terms of reporting and disclosure. Integrated reporting should of necessity include ESG, which is that you are reporting against certain indicators, but those indicators are tied back to what your strategic objectives are and who your stakeholders are. How are we doing as an organization? So certainly the board must take responsibility for it, but from an oversight perspective, the reality is though that, and if we look at integrated reporting, you've got to look at it from an integrated journey perspective and integrated thinking. So what's happening now is people are simply moving annual report out and slotting integrated report in. And an annual report was just, well, this is how I did, you know, for the kind of past or previous financial period. Whereas what we're saying now with integrated reporting, in terms of that integrated thinking, is decide upfront what it is that you want to do in this cycle, who your stakeholders are, and then tell us how you did, and be authentic, open, and vulnerable around where you did well, where you fell short, and where there was something like a pandemic or something which caused huge change. What was the impact on the business and how you pivoted, etc. In terms of reporting on your sustainability considerations for your stakeholders. So your board is a different stakeholder, an institutional investor is a different stakeholder, your employees are different stakeholders, and the public at large is a different stakeholder, and they need different reports to be presented in a different manner so that they understand exactly what the issues are. So we don't, you know, baffle with a whole lot of BS and a whole lot of voluminous reports. So that's why, you know, just to digress, dashboard reporting is quite good. But when it comes to ESG specifically, ESG are now indicators. And again, what I'm a bit concerned about is ESG is now the new thing, the new kid on the block. And yet ESG, like everything else that we've had to talk about and we've raised today, is something that the board has to talk to. You've got to take a step back and ask, why is reporting and disclosure so important? And do you appreciate that it is also there as a tracking mechanism, as a mechanism to assess your performance against objective, to hold you accountable, and to appreciate your transparency and bring your stakeholders closer to the organization so that you can all contribute, common and proper purpose, towards sustainability. Now, whether you are talking about environmental and climate change, it's not just about, you know, how much paper you use and whether, you know, you're using plastic plants or how much waste is being produced. Are you an effective and ethical corporate citizen within the ecosystem in which you operate? From a societal perspective, you know, we talk about diversity is one thing, but diversity is not inclusion. And we still haven't gotten to the point where we are inclusive. And then you talk about governance. Well, are we doing things in a manner that, again, is not so complex that nobody understands it? But are we, you know, are we operating in a way that is optimal in terms of achieving what we set out to do? So yes, short answer is yes, but let's not get pulled down a rabbit hole with ESG, because the board is responsible for giving oversight to all reporting and disclosure. But again, give guidance. And to do that, you need to take a few steps back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Faye. And in the end, reporting, while it started as compliance and still necessary for compliance and regulation, reporting is a huge communication tool. And what Faye said, if you start with it from the start, saying this is what we want to report on, rather than sitting at the end of the phase saying, well, what can we report on? It makes a huge difference. Ansie, this one is for you, from Johan Meyer. What is the role of the chairman of the board and the lead independent director? Directors need to ask critical questions on these focus areas, but the board chairman has to listen and take the lead on these matters, ?
Yes, no, I think Johan makes a very valid comment. The chair and the lead I mean, it's trite. But just again, yesterday I read in an article that says just because you state the obvious doesn't mean that it's doesn't have value. Sometimes things have to be heard over and over again. And the chair and the lead independent directors set the tone. And the tone is something subtle but very important. The tone is, for example, human resources. The SEC now recently said or issued a regulation that companies need to disclose more fully on human resources, human capital, as they call it, management. So is the tone that is being set by the chair and the LID, is this going to be a tick box exercise, a compliance exercise? Or are we taking to heart the lessons that we learned in the pandemic? Are we understanding the stresses under which our employees work, both when they work from the office and from home? Are we concerned, authentically and truly concerned, about their wellness, health, and safety? Do we understand our communication, engagement, productivity, the issues that impact on it? So if that is the tone, we can easily just have a report at the board and say, we've done this wellness survey and this, and this, that. So it can be dealt with very dismissively and as a procedural thing, and we can treat our employees as utilities in a transactional way, or we can truly care, do it with empathy. That is exactly the sort of tone that the chair and the LID is supposed to set. So a chair doesn't have an extra vote, well, shouldn't, shall I say, or any of those things. The chair is the one that dictates how much discussion is allocated to certain things, the tone of the discussion, the which issues get the most attention. Very, very critical. It's one of those intangible things, but very critical.
Thanks, Ansie. Ralph, the next question is I'm going to direct to you, and it ties in with what Ansie's answered now. From Walter, to what extent is CEOs setting the board agenda versus boards setting the agenda a problem? Are boards losing sight of their primary responsibility to set strategy and hold the CEO account? I've also been in a situation where it was the chair and the company secretary set the agenda in consultation with the CEO. Your advice?
Yeah, essentially, and I mean, Ansie's touched on it, the chair manages the board. So between the chair and the company secretary, there are a whole lot of things that's why you do a work plan for the year. And it fills up your agenda at each meeting for what you need to cover. As a chair, you want that to be planned. And then I like to see business of the day, if you call it that, which are items where anybody, whether they're on the board or they're an executive and they wish to add an item, they need to engage with the chair to say, we wish to table this, I'd like to put it onto the agenda. Absolutely no problem with that. But it's dictated by the chair. The setting and the company secretary will help with that. But there has to be space for items to be tabled at the board. But it should be fed through the chair, in my view. And I just leave it open as 3 items on, or 3 or 4, whatever they are, business to be discussed that day, whether it be a motivation for something or whatever it might be. But I'd just like to emphasize, and maybe again, what Ansie said, I think bad chairman, bad board. And boards need to address that, because it's not the most senior person, it's not a position, it's selected by the board every year. So if you're having a problem with the chair, chat to them and move them out. They don't have to leave the board, they can just be a board member. You can do it delicately. If they're unhappy, they'll leave. But I mean, that's the problem. They control, the chair controls how well that board functions. And you want to leave a board meeting, say, who the hell directed us there? It ran smoothly, no one dominated. You don't want a dominant chair. It's a critical position. It's the gap. The chair should be meeting with the executive at least once a month over coffee to talk about what's going on, build trust. It's a chair's job. Sorry, I've deviated a bit, but I hope I answered the question that was asked.
You have, and you've jumped on one of my soapboxes as well. Ego has no place in the boardroom, none at all. It just spoils things. Faye, the next question is for you, and it's from Mark. And I think, no, it's not from Mark. Which one? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it's into your dashboard reporting, but almost a little bit of a, before we get to the reporting bit. From Mark, how do we have balanced board agendas? Often too much information in the pack and presentations and so on, and little time for a strategic discussion and reflection. Now, in your Know Thyself, read and understand and learn, how would you answer this question from Mark?
So when it comes to board packs, and this forms part of your reporting framework, then what I find is that boards don't spend, I was going to say nearly enough time, but let me say they don't spend any time talking about necessarily how the reporting, within the reporting framework, how the reporting to board should actually be presented. Because every organization, every board has a different set of requirements based on the industry, sector, nature, size, complexity of the organization, etc. Also, you need to understand who the individuals on the board are, and different adults learn differently. So when I say I like dashboards, that's because I'm a kinesthetic and a visual learner. That's who I am, and that's why I like it. I know some of the boards I sit on, the board members are different. And so you have to, the good chairperson would actually make allowance on an agenda for discussion around how we would like our board packs compiled and presented. Because you have to tie that into what is the board's role. And the board is a decision-making body. And so we're not there to talk and talk and talk and debate issues that have already been debated. We're there to make decisions. But what that means is the executive in compiling the board pack needs to support that endeavor. And that means that board members need to be able to synthesize and distill key information from a pack in order for them to make the decisions that are required. So the manner in which it's not just what's in the board pack, but the manner in which things are presented. And I know where I sit and not just as the chair, where I'm even a board member, you must make suggestions. I like motivation memoranda. And so you get, for example, what the context, the background is, what the risks are, opportunities and threats. If it is going to have a supply chain management impact, I want to hear from that executive. If it's going to have a financial impact on that executive, etc. Just a few lines, bullet pointed. I don't like more than 2 or 3 pages per motivation memo. What's the CEO's recommendation? And then what exactly are they asking for? So you almost want them to draft the resolution and be specific, because that's what they're asking for. And they need to preempt what the questions are that the board will ask. So when you look at drafting your agenda, and it must be according to your work plan, but with some flexibility, then the items that would be included in the board pack will need to be in line with that work plan and the agenda to move the board along in terms of its annual responsibilities. So that's key. There's a difference between the board pack and general items of information. So if you're also getting a 600 to 900 page pack, even 7 to 10 days before, it's humanly impossible. And that's a key indicator that something ain't right. So having said that, when I sit on a new board, I like information just to get to grips with what's going on, but that doesn't need to be in the pack itself. It's also important that we say rule of thumb, your board meetings should be 3 hours. But if you're sitting in a complex multinational, maybe you need a day or 2 days for a board meeting. So again, it will be dictated and determined by what the company or organization's objectives and direction are and what the board requirements are. I sit on one board where the board pack is very traditional and old school, and that's because of the chairperson. And we're looking at about 120 page board pack. It's not as succinct as I would like it, but it fits the profile and does what it needs to do. On another board that I sit on, I kid you not, we have 5 pages in landscape. They've juxtaposed a program and project management methodology onto the company. They talk to indicators, etc. And if we need any information, we ask in advance and we get it via presentation. So again, as to how these things are delivered must be a discussion point. And I would encourage everybody to put it on the agenda at the next board meeting, because minutes, like board packs, are strategic tools. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Faye, for that comprehensive answer. So Ansie, you're welcome to give your comment as well. And then the final question will be for you. So just unmute yourself and go for it, Solon.
Just very quickly, because I know our time is running out, and I just want to pick up on Faye's point about using the minutes and so on as a strategic tool. There was a question on integrated reporting, and I want to tell you that an integrated report is a strategic tool to the board. So many companies would say to me, But why do we have to spend so much time and resources on an integrated report? Because we are sure so few of our stakeholders actually read it. And then I say, well, let's, for the purposes of the argument, assume that you are correct and that your stakeholders actually don't read your integrated report. Don't do your integrated report for your stakeholders then, do it for you as the board. Because that same discipline as you apply towards compiling your integrated report is the discipline that you want applied to compilation of your agenda and compilation of the board pack. If you cross-reference your annual agenda back to the integrated report, if you map it back, there must be correlation. You must see the linkages. If you look at the reports that were tabled at the board, there must be a clear link between what was tabled at the board and what you now are presenting to your stakeholders. If there's a huge disconnect, then either your integrated report is an issue or the information that you receive as a board is an issue. Of course, the slant of it will be different. The reporting to stakeholders will be at a higher level, all of those differences, but you must be able to see the thematic connect. There are certain tools that you use to reduce the information in your integrated report. Those same tools, materiality, applying risk, the stakeholder lens, all of that applies to your board pack as well. I just wanted to mention
Thanks
that.
very much, Ansie. The final question is directed, or I'm directing it at you, Ansie, is from Sharon. In my somewhat limited experience, I have found that boards do not, in many cases, have any form of real IT risk and opportunity understanding. I've also seen how management sanitizes information and make out that they are doing a better job than they actually are. Given the role of technology and the speed of change, surely there must be someone on the board that can assist the team, the board, in understanding or monitoring the risks and opportunities. Your thoughts on this specific issue, whether it belongs with a person, whether it belongs with board, with executives, or with the committee?
I see where you're coming from, Sharon, and it may very well be that you need a person on the board depending on the nature of your company. But I don't know that it's true that each and every company should have an IT person. It's good maybe to have if you can, and let me explain to you why I'm saying it. Again, I get back to you have tools as a non-executive director, combined assurance. So I would say it's much more important that in your internal audit team, for example, you have the IT knowledge and capability to assess the IT processes in your organization, in your company. As a non-executive director, you will not come to that hands-on testing, assessment that is done by internal audit on your internal controls as far as IT is concerned. So that's the one tool that you can use. The other thing, and that's part of combined assurance, if they get outside advice and opinion so that you don't have to rely solely on management. Get expert opinion. If IT is for you a high risk area, and I venture to say that for most companies it is nowadays, it doesn't harm for the risk committee to say, listen, at our next meeting, we want a presentation from an IT expert to start off with, for example, what the particular technology risks are in our industry and how they should ideally be managed. Just to stress test again that the thinking of management. So those are the sorts of things that you can use to compensate. As a director, also don't forget your questions. If you don't have the expertise on the particular issue, you need to do some homework. Part of that is getting expert opinion on, part of that is getting assurance from internal audit, say, for example, or even an external assurance provider, cyber penetration testing is now done by specialists, so it may be necessary to do that. And in addition to that, as a director, you challenge. So what are the assumptions that you are using to come to this conclusion? You must challenge management to, if you see that they advocate down a particular course, say, I want to hear the argument for the opposite conclusion. Challenge management in that way, disrupt their thinking. That's what you're supposed to do as a director, even if you're not a specialist. If you need one on the board, fair, but I'm saying you don't need to rely on that only.
Thanks very much, Ansie. Dear audience members, thank you so very much for sticking with us. This was a wonderful conversation for me, and if I'm looking at the chats quickly, it was for everybody else as well. I'm going to hand over to Vikeshni for the formal close of the session.
Thank you, Juanita, and thank you to all our panelists this morning for giving off their time. I agree with you. The chat room has been on fire from the beginning with lots of comments. I thought I could summarize some of the points that you said, but I think you've all mentioned so many things. I think the biggest things I got from it was risk management, and the risk register is probably a big key thing to relook at and make sure we are assessing the impact of consequences and not necessarily the causes. The soft skills came up a lot in terms of focus areas that we should be focusing on, board composition, and Faye's comment on not failing, but rather making sure we focus on monitoring and changing direction quicker also has stuck with me as well. So thank you so much for this. It was very valuable, and I'm sure we will do more of these in the future. So we'll see everyone again next week. And thank you again for contributing and for our members attending.